Chapter 18 is called The Town Fair. David awoke on the morning of the fair bright and early. Out of all the project members, he certainly had the most right to be nervous about events later in the day. He was, after all, going to be solely responsible for their dealings with the Prime Minister. To his surprise, though, feelings of apprehension were entirely absent. Instead, he felt a warm excitement and couldn't stop thinking about how the judges would react when they tasted Mr. Torrance's baking. After a quick wash and breakfast, David was out of his front door and heading towards the big marquee. With his dad usually working over the weekend and his mum busying herself with online networking opportunities, David was getting used to being left to his own devices. He knew that he'd be arriving a good half hour before any of the others, but he wanted to properly visualise the space. No matter how many photos and maps Trevor was able to conjure up, it never felt real until he could see the place with his own eyes. Arriving at the fair, David sat on one of the park benches and started to take it all in. Given that he'd arrived a good hour before opening time, the place felt remarkably busy. A group of vans from different TV stations were pulled up in the library's new car park, with glamorous-looking presenters sipping steaming hot takeaway coffees. Beside them, workmen in luminous vests were moving metal fences to cordon off a press area beside the library's entrance, a prime position for the culmination of the day's events, with the cutting of the ribbon which stretched across the front doors. The organisers had clearly gone to a real effort to make the outside of the library look particularly special, probably realising that it would provide the best photo opportunities for the Prime Minister. It almost resembled some kind of Hollywood film premiere, with a red carpet leading down the steps and giant ornamental vases on either side of the doors. In the park beside the library, catering vans were now set up and delicious smells of frying onions and sizzling donuts filled the air. The marquee, of course, was the area of greatest activity. Not only would it house all the entries to the baking competition, but it was also to be filled with a variety of stalls, as well as a large pop-up cafe which would be selling items from Miss Fleck's bakery. The entrance of the marquee, therefore, seemed to have a constant queue of people going in with arms laden with all kinds of items, and others leaving again to grab even more things to fill the tables with. David watched the people with interest. A few of them he recognised, parents of children he'd gone to school with, neighbours and faces he'd seen in different shops about town. Mostly, though, he felt he was watching a bunch of strangers. People would travel far to attend an event with as much exposure as this, he supposed. As the arranged meeting time was starting to grow gradually closer, he looked up and saw two faces he definitely recognised. Miss Fleck and Mr. Torrance were walking together towards the marquee. His teacher clearly in a patriotic mood, as a pair of ridiculously garish Union Jack braces were stretched over his shoulders. A nod to the Prime Minister, David thought, but also a rather practical solution for ensuring that his trousers would stay fully pulled up when he was in the public eye. Balanced carefully in the crook of his right arm, Mr. Torrance carried a tall, admittedly exquisite-looking chocolate cake, which was built up over 3 tiers and decorated with piped red icing and a very intricate floral design. If the competition was judged on looks alone, David thought, Mr. Torrance could be in with a chance. His teacher definitely looked confident. He walked with a swagger and a very self-satisfied grin. A look that was unlikely to stick around after the tasting, David reminded himself with a smirk. Just as Mr. Torrance and Miss Fleck were about to enter the marquee, David noticed something which took him completely by surprise. The two figures had been walking side by side up until that point, but with all the busy comings and goings of the marquee, they had no choice but to move into single file. As they did so, David saw as clear as day that they had let go of each other's hands. They hadn't just been walking to the fair together as a random coincidence. They'd been walking there as a couple. How on earth Trevor, their master of surveillance, had failed to notice that two of their biggest targets were romantically linked was rather astounding. David was suddenly itching for the others to arrive so that he could share this scandalous news. About 20 minutes later, Trevor, Chris and Amy arrived outside the marquee. David, of course, wasted no time in telling them about what he had just seen, which instantly made both boys look shocked and a bit queasy. Amy couldn't care less. She was already making a beeline towards the swings over in the play park. Well, they certainly must be very discreet, Trevor said eventually. They didn't go anywhere near each other in the time that I was watching them. Having managed to get over his initial shock, Chris seemed deep in thought. You'd think a judge who was going out with one of the contestants would be somewhat biased, he said. Maybe Mr. Torrance will end up winning after all. Miss Fleck is not the only judge, David began to explain, and even if she was, there is no way on earth she could plonk prizes on the cake which was responsible for destroying half of her taste buds. Plus, you're losing sight of our main goal here, to get the Prime Minister tasting that cake and making sure that the press are around to capture his reaction. Becky arrived a few minutes after the agreed time wearing an oversized hoodie which covered up her hair. She looked shifty and suspicious, glancing around in every direction before moving to join the rest of the project members. Right, we're all here. Let's get into that marquee to watch the judging, she said, moving away from the group before David had even had a chance of passing on his gossip about Miss Fleck and Mr. Torrance. It didn't take a genius to work out the reasons behind Becky's sudden change of behaviour. This was her first time out in public with the other project members, and while she had already proven in school that her hostility towards them all had come to an end, being seen hanging around with them at the weekend was a whole new ballgame. If anyone spotted them, she would be the one on the receiving end of the jokes and laughter come Monday morning. The group had no choice but to follow Becky. They snaked through the crowds towards the marquee entrance, each paying their £5 entry fee before stepping into the giant tent. Given the fact that the fair had been open for less than half an hour, the marquee was surprisingly busy. Most would have made a point of arriving in plenty of time to make sure they caught a glimpse of the Prime Minister, David supposed, as he was only due to stick around for an hour or two. After an hour or so of browsing the stalls at the fair, the project members reconvened at the agreed meeting point near the marquee's entrance, ready for the judging. They moved themselves to a position by one of the side walls of the tent. This not only kept them away from the worst of the crowds, but gave them a great view of the judging tables, which were laden with around a dozen stunningly presented cakes. Beside the table of cakes, the contestants stood nervously, making awkward small talk with one another. Each baker wore a brightly coloured rosette, which corresponded with one of the same colour placed in front of each cake. Mr. Torrance, who towered a good few inches above any of the other bakers, wore a deep shade of crimson, which appropriately was almost the exact shade of his cake's secret ingredient. Watching Mr. Torrance attempt small talk with the other contestants was funny at first, but as the minutes ticked by, it became quite a painful sight. Everybody was becoming impatient for something to happen. Eventually, there was a murmur of excitement by the marquee's entrance as 4 sharply dressed men rushed in, listening intently to earpieces whilst gesturing to the public to clear a path. David heard the rapturous applause before he himself had the chance to glimpse the Prime Minister. Scurrying forward into a space with a clearer view, he finally saw him. It's a very strange experience seeing somebody famous in real life. Alfred Thorpe had been Prime Minister for as long as David could remember. He would often see him on TV when his parents watched the news, little clips from Parliament, press interviews, etc. David had never really paid much attention to anything the man said, but he appeared to be a very bold and confident man. Seeing him in person gave a very different impression. More than anything, the Prime Minister appeared to be quite uncomfortable. His movement through the crowds was quite clumsy and awkward. His pace was rather stop-start, and not really knowing where to look, he almost tripped over on a couple of occasions. A few school children were positioned right at the front with paper and pens, clearly hoping for an autograph. The Prime Minister didn't ignore them as such. It was almost as if he hadn't seen them in the first place, with his glazed eyes staring into the distance. His robotic hands waving and plastered-on smile were the only things even approaching interaction with his public. By the time the Prime Minister had reached the judging tables and shaken the hands of each of the contestants, Edna Fleck had also arrived ready to help choose the winner. Photographers and camera crews were set up close to the action, ready to help fill the evening editions of the papers and TV news. The cake tasting, it turned out, was exceptionally dull. For the first 3 cakes, the Prime Minister offered his feedback first. It turned out that Alfred Thorpe was not particularly well experienced in the world of food criticism. for he gave identical comments to each of the bakers. Yum, nice and sweet, he would say without any clue of how to elaborate or draw on even a hint of negativity. Edna was obviously becoming quite irritated by the Prime Minister's unimaginative comments. So much so that by the fourth baker, she made sure that she butted in with her feedback before the Prime Minister had a chance to say anything. Far too crumbly a consistency. It's like eating sand. What an embarrassment, she snapped. The Prime Minister, visibly relieved at getting to avoid the pressure of being the first judge to comment, merely offered a diluted version of what Edna had just said. The cake's a bit dry, he chipped in. The next few cakes were judged in much the same fashion. Edna's feedback was almost always cruel and scathing, and the Prime Minister would add his own feeble comments at the end. At last came the turn of Mr. Torrance. The project members all shared quick glances with one another. They were struggling to suppress their nervous giggles, and all the children were completely transfixed by the judging table, straining to get the best view possible. Even Becky by this stage had forgotten about who she was standing beside, her hood now down and her face showing a beaming smile. A small slice of Mr. Torrance's cake was presented to both Miss Fleck and the Prime Minister. Miss Fleck took a moment to examine the cross-section of the sponge, much in the same fashion as she had done with the previous entries, studying both the slice on her plate and the structure of the remaining cake on the podium. Alfred Thorpe, meanwhile, stood gormlessly watching Edna, waiting for her to finish her ritual so they could begin the actual tasting. By the time both of the judges had plunged their cake forks into the sponge and slowly taken a bite of Mr. Torrance's baking, Chris and Becky could contain themselves no longer. They'd grabbed a hold of each other's arms and were jumping up and down on the spot. It took a sharp elbow and a piercing stare from Trevor for them to get themselves back under control. David hadn't even noticed what the others were up to. His full focus was on the faces of the two judges. His breath held as he awaited everything to kick off. He watched them slowly chew, expecting the sudden widening of eyes, sweaty brows and flushed cheeks as the ghost peppers began to do their thing. The Prime Minister and Edna Fleck continued to eat, and the project members continued to wait. But nothing happened. Swallowing the last of her cake, Edna began to speak. "This cake is stunning," she began, in such an animated and passionate tone that she seemed like a completely different person. The richness of the chocolate is offset beautifully by the sharp raspberry topping. The cake is moist and baked evenly throughout. It is very professionally executed and is wonderfully delicious. You must be very proud, Mr. Torrance. David's jaw hung open. What he saw in front of him made absolutely no sense. Yes, he had already suspected potential bias coming from Miss Fleck, but there was no way on earth she could mask the volcanic effects of one of the world's hottest chili peppers. And even if she somehow could, how would that explain the Prime Minister's immunity to such heat? Truth be told, there was only one person who had the misfortune of sampling the chili-laced cake, and that was the baker himself. For if Trevor or any of the other bakers had continued, for if Trevor or any of the other project members had continued to keep surveillance on Mr. Torrance's house the previous nights, they would have seen their suspicious teacher tasting a small sample of his raw cake mix before putting it in the oven. They would have heard Mr. Torrance screaming in pain and seen the veins in his neck pulsating before watching him drink a full 2-litre bottle of milk with such urgency that a great deal of it ended up down his shirt front. Later, the project members would have bore witness to a distressed phone conversation, followed by a visit from a much more experienced baker, who would help Mr. Torrance create something which would be equally as memorable, but for far more positive reasons. The project members were all stunned in silence. All that planning, all that hard work for nothing. Watching their teacher bask in the glowing feedback was torturous. His smug, self-satisfied smile was sickening. By the looks on their faces, David knew that the others were thinking the same as him. And if it wasn't for the fact that they still had the second phase of their plan to take care of, he would have been leaving the town fair at that very instant. As the judges moved on to taste the next cake, Mr. Torrance continued to grin from ear to ear, thumbs casually stretching his Union Jack braces. Their teacher was no longer looking or listening to the judges. Instead, his eyes began to survey the crowd in front of him. After a few seconds, his eyes stopped moving, and he seemed to lock in on the project members themselves before giving them the smuggest look of all. A knowing look that told them, without a shadow of a doubt, that he knew they were the ones behind the cake sabotage. Suddenly, David, Trevor, and Becky's attention became averted from the judging tables as they became aware of Chris quickly moving from spot to spot and pushing the people beside him. He appeared to be frantically searching for something. "Chris, is everything okay?" said Trevor, concerned for his friend. "Amy. I can't find Amy," Chris snapped back, his cheeks completely drained of colour. "Have any of you seen her? Where could she be? Amy! Amy!" And that's the end of chapter 18. That was a long chapter. Still got a few chapters to go. There's 23 chapters in all in the whole book. I'm going to do my best to record these as soon as I can so we can get to the end of the novel. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much, and see you again soon. Bye.